Hi and welcome to this week's video. I'm Stefan and I explain you the basics of CSS. First, I'm going to explain the CSS selector's specificity hierarchy. After that, I'm going to show you what kind of CSS selectors there are, like the different types. And then I'm going to show you how to use them. Keep watching. Alright, so I created here an HTML file called index and a style CSS file. Both are still empty, so what we are going to do first is to create an HTML5 document here. And now we are going to, first thing we have to do actually, that our styles from the CSS file are applied within the document. We need to tell the document here is our CSS file. So what we are going to do, we're using the link tag, specified a rel tag attribute here to tell this is a style sheet. And then we are specifying where this styles CSS can be found. So this could also be on a different server because it's just a link to that file. This one I'm calling CSS Basics. There we go. Okay, so which selectors are there? Well, let's begin. Which hierarchy do we have on CSS selectors? So if we have a div tag, for example, which just puts out hello, the most specific selector is the style attribute. So if we type in style equals and then something, let's say we want to switch the color here to show a blue color, this would be the most specific selector you can use, since it's directly on the DOM. So as you can see in our element in our website currently, this would be outputted as blue. And to show you what I mean by hierarchy, we taking the next, so the second most important selector is the ID. So if we would apply here an ID which says, let's just type it in as hello, then we can't override the style with to red here because the style tag is still more important than the actual ID. So still blue, and as soon as I remove the inline style tag, it's getting red. Okay, so the ID is the second most specific selector here. After that, the class selector, pseudo selectors, and the attributes are following. So attributes are actually, for example, class is an attribute here, and let's just call it heading. So the class is called heading here now, and if we apply the color blue here again, then the heading still would be red. And first, if I remove the ID from the HTML element, then the heading class would be used. Same for attributes. So class could be also selected here. So if an HTML element would have the attribute class, the color blue would be set, for example. Attribute selectors written like that. And then we could call it color blue. take red again. And here's another specificity. So in CSS, if the selectors are in the hierarchy, if they are equal, so like the class selector and the attribute selector, then always the last style will win. So the CSS file is read from top to bottom. And what's happening here is that the heading is turned first into blue, and then after that we turn it into red. So if we flip this statement here, then our heading would be blue again, because the blue rule is the last one. And then there's one last selector, which is the least important selector, is the element itself. So if we would style the heading 1 to be colored green, even if it would be the last one to be red, it still would be blue, because the class selector here is more specific than the element selector. So this has two reasons. If we have a closer look to the element selector or tag selector, then you know what this means. So hello world. You can guess and write into the comments what color will have the H1 here now. So these are our styles. The heading is turned into blue and the H1 should be green in this case. This is a simple reason, because we didn't apply the class heading here to the world heading. So if we now would just add the attribute class, which wouldn't make sense in this case, because you always want to add a value also to your attribute, then this would become red. There we go. Because the class selector here, we select here only the attribute without any value, and then we apply it to the element, and that's why we select here the color red. But don't code if you are hungry, so I will get something to eat first. So that was delicious. Let's continue. But we already said that the ID selector, besides the inline style tag, is the most powerful selector you can have in a CSS document here. This sounds actually pretty good, because then you could set to all elements an ID, and you could make sure that the styles which you write are applied to that element. But actually that's not what you want to do. What you want to do is you want to write specificities which are as low as much, so that you can override them easily. If you would, for example, have a H1 in your document, then you don't add an ID to that element here to give it a heading and style it, because that would be not necessary. If you have a document which looks like that, then you just could use the H1 selector. And as already said, the ID selector can be written in the CSS document or the CSS Cascading Style sheet file with the hash. at the front. So that's how you select or you tell the style sheet to that's an ID, and please look into the document where this ID can be found. So an important is that if you write your ID, don't write the hash in here as well. Just write the ID itself. Then the class selector is the next most important selector, which is probably also the most useful selector because of different reasons. The first reason is you can add more classes to an HTML element. So you can add a heading, for example, a heading class here, and a heading, let's say bold class. And what you could do in your document, a class is always the dot in the document and the CSS file. So dot, and then you write heading, class name, and we could style or give it a blue color. And then we could also take the second class, which we defined, the heading bold, and we could tell it should be red, and we could also font weight and use bold here. If you inspect files in your browser, you can actually see how the CSS rules are overwritten. So as you can see, the first style which is applied is the H1, which would be green, but we override that with the heading bold class, which is red, and then we override this again with the heading, which is the color blue. And this is overridden here because we have the heading here as the last rule and the heading bold here. So we don't override the font weight in this class. That's why we still have the font weight bold applied, but then we override the color of the bold class here. So that's why the blue colors is applied. Another reason why the class selector is probably the best selector is that the class selector is actually well supported over all browsers, all versions. You won't have any compatibility problems within your website if you use class selectors. Then we have the tag selector, which is basically the selector from the DOM itself. It's actually useful if you want to use this to override some default properties which the browser sets. So as you have seen, the browser here, for example, says that the H1 should be actually a font size of 2 EM. Display block, margins, and so on are defined here as a default. So if you want to override some of those default properties, or if you want to display certain elements always the same way. So for example, if you think about a list in HTML, you want to style maybe the list output always the same, or for in this example, you want to override, for example, the H1 as not as a bold font, but maybe as lightweight font or so. I wouldn't rely on the element tags too much and rather use classes for that. I would only use that if I don't have the control over the class. So let's say the document is dynamic and I pull in content from another source where I can't set the class to specific elements. Probably would use the element selector here to style certain content. But if I would have the heading inserted by myself, I probably would add here a class which is heading. And then we have the attribute selector. So the powerful thing of the attribute selector is actually that you can select any attribute you want, and you actually can also add or select the value of the attribute. So let's assume we have two paragraphs in here, some text, and we have another paragraph in here, some other text. What I can do in HTML is to set my own attribute here. So I could just add the attribute text here. And in here I could say this is the main text. And here I could tell this is a sub text. So in my CSS, I could select this now as the attribute selector, which are those brackets. And in here I type in the name of the selector, which is text. And then I also could add the value to the selector. So I could specify it now to only this specific rule should only apply to the main text. And in here I could say font size, let's say this is 20 pixels. And then I do the same thing for the subtext. And this would only be, let's put it to 14 pixels. And then I also could define a rule for both elements. And let's take gray and select both elements with that and put a color to it. Now I should have two text elements where this one would be 20 pixels and a gray color, and this would be 40 pixels with a gray color. And there we go. So both have the gray color from the selector just for the attribute itself. And then because this has the value main in it, we have the font size 20 pixels, and because this one has the sub in it, we have the 40 pixels applied. So this is actually pretty strong and flexible, more flexible than the class selector. The only downside on that is, I think, is that it's not supported across all browsers. So for example, for Internet Explorer 6, it's not supported, but I think nowadays you don't really have to care if you want to support Internet Explorer 6. Yeah, I guess it depends on your use case and your users. Another selector are the pseudo selectors, which can also be split into two selectors. One is the positional selector, and the other one would be pseudo selectors, which are actually inserting something into the DOM. So a positional selector could be, for example, let's create a quick list. Let's take this list here, and so I would select here the list element, and then I would select the pseudo selector, which is always written as a column, and then I select with the function every second child, and let's assign a red color so that we can see the difference. And as you can see, we now have a list here. We selected with the element selector the list element or the list item actually. Within that we select every second child and we set the color red to that. So if we add here dynamically, let's say this is also again dynamically content, we add here some more childs. And every second list item would be styled to red. And we could do this with any number, so we could also insert here a 3, then every third item would be red. Or if we say 1, then of course each item is red, and so on. We also have the not selector here as another example, which is not, and then let's say list item. And if we add the class list item here, then all the elements are getting red except for the item 4, which has the class list item on it. So we also could select items which are not something, which is also pretty neat. So the other selector are the pseudo selectors, which are the double column. And this could be, for example, an after, which will add an element or which will add something to the H1 after that. So And as you can see, we just added to the H1 heading here, we added the after pseudo selector, which should contain after. This can be done for stuff like where you want to add something to the page from your style sheet. This could be content. This can have different reasons to do something like that. You could, for example, add nothing here and just add a border and so on. So you would have an actual after element, which is not affecting the H1 itself, but you have an element to select in your DOM to add, for example, underlining border to your heading, or to add anything else, an icon or whatever. So what's also pretty neat is that you can combine selectors. So you can combine all the different selectors, so IDs, classes, pseudo selectors, or the elements, to be even more specific to them. So if you have an H2 and you have a style applied there, then you could be more specific. If the H2 has, for example, the class 1 applied, then do this. And if the H2 has the class 2 applied, do something else. So there are selectors which are affecting the selectors itself. So you could, for example, let's say we have a class 1, and we could use the, how's that sign called? Bigger than sign. You can use this sign to select a child, a direct child of something. We quickly do that here. So if I'm going to, let's delete that for now. Let's say I have a div element here, and I have a div element here, and I have a div element here. So if I apply the class 1 here, and I apply the class 2 here, and I apply the class 1 here, then this text here should get red, which it does. That's because we are selecting class 1, and within that we select the direct child of class 2. So if I wrap this into another div element, then the class 1 is, the class 2 is not a direct child of class 1 anymore, because there's another div element in here. So this could be actually, let's say, class 1, 2 also. And then the something else text wouldn't turn into red, because there's another element between that. So it's not a direct child. How to select this then? You just remove the direct child selector, and then this would be read for the browser as class 1, and in there's a class 2 element, and then we have a red text again, because it doesn't have to be the direct child of it. So, and besides those more specific selectors, there's also the universal selector, which is basically the selector for everything. That selector actually doesn't have any specificity. So if you use that and you just use another selector in your DOM, you basically override it immediately with that. So we could, for example, define a margin 10 pixels to all elements now, and then all elements in our DOM would have that margin of 10 pixels. But if I write now that the H1 should actually have a margin of 20 pixels, then this is immediately overwritten. Then the H1 immediately gets the 20 pixels, even if we write the element selector, which is the most weak one, as you know, at the top. So this is still stronger because the star selector, I don't know how to call that sign, but like that selector doesn't have any specificity. Another thing is that you also could override styles. So if we use a class and add, for example, margin of 40 pixels. And we apply that class to, let's write the style for the h1 here. Let's remove maybe not everything, but the diffs here. So getting more clear again. So for the h1, we defined a margin 20 pixels, and then we have the more specific selector class, which says this element should have 40 pixels. So now the element would have 40 pixels as expected. But what we could do if we don't want this, we want to override the selector. Where is this a use case? So let's say you have a whole CSS and HTML document and everything is written well, but that one heading should behave differently from the others. And you actually are at the end of the specificity. So let's say you already have written an ID to that, then you can't be more specific than that. So you could override it with an important. And the important wins always. So no matter how specific I get now, the important will win. So even it will win over the inline style. So if I define here a margin of, let's say 100 pixels, then still this wouldn't be applied because we have an important. It will wins always. This is a cool thing you can use, but very important, I would use it only if there's no other way to be more specific. Don't use it just because you're lazy to find a more specific selector. The more important statements you use later on, the more tricky it gets to actually override those styles again, right? Keep it in mind that you can do it if it's necessary, but don't use it if you can be more specific in another way. So there are a lot of ways to define CSS rules, to structure them, and to be more specific or less specific in CSS. Most importantly is that you be consistent with your CSS structure and how you write it. Otherwise, this can quickly get messy. And also, you could tend to override your own styles if you're not specific enough, or to just don't structure it right because one style is written then after the other and overrides the style which you didn't want it to override. And you basically write it again instead of restructuring your CSS maybe. So I hope you liked this CSS Basics tutorial. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel. Also let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos like that, or if you have any additions to that, because there are much more in CSS you can do. Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, see you in the next one.